those voices rolling around, let's say in the back of their head, of fear and guilt and shame and disappointment and regret and doubt. And they want to actually think that in fact could be God. But God is not as hard on you as you are on yourself. And
yes,
this is also what this return to essence is.
It's our limiting beliefs that ultimately keep us from becoming the best we're capable of becoming. Something's got to change, but that change has to happen first on the inside. It's time to get unstuck. It's time to get your why back. It's never too late. Let's start today.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey, my friends, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Thanks for the download. As always, this is episode 137 of Win Today. This is your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. You know, guys, the journey to become the best version of yourself is a dynamic and fluid process that requires a ton of self-awareness and self-observation. And if you're anything like me, that process can definitely be painful. But you know, I really believe that the reward in doing so unlocks the unique potential for which all of us have been created. And to that, one of the most powerful tools for self-observation and discovery is the Enneagram. You know, within the last year, we've talked with Ian Cron and most recently, Sleeping at Last's Ryan O'Neill. But today, we're taking a deep dive into all things Enneagram once again with one of the most trusted voices on the subject in the world, Chris Heuertz. Chris Heuertz's life was forever changed after he learned about the Enneagram more than 15 years ago. And since then, he has trained under some of the great living Enneagram masters, including Father Richard Rohr, Russ Hudson, Marion Gilbert, and Helen Palmer. In addition, Chris spent time under the tutelage of Mother Theresa. Today, Chris leads Enneagram workshops all over the world, and this week, Chris will show you how this ancient tool can help you awaken to the gifts God has given you, find freedom from your personal patterns of sin and fear, and grow in acceptance of your identity as you grow with the Lord. After having listened to today's conversation with Chris, you're going to learn how to discover your type, how to understand the why behind your type, beyond caricatures and stereotypes, how to identify and find freedom from self-destructive patterns, how to grow in your reasoning ability, and how to face your past and step toward healing so that you can become the very best you're capable of becoming, which is the pursuit of wholeness. So right now, friends, buckle up, lean in, let's get to my conversation with the one, with the only, Chris Heuertz. Well, Chris, this is a real treat. Welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate you including me on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Chris, my passion for my friends here on the show is the pursuit of wholeness. And for a lot of people joined with us today, the Enneagram is new territory. And in the Sacred Enneagram, you describe it as the sacred map of the soul. I want to start there. What do you mean by that? I mean, can you distill that down for us by maybe giving us a 30,000-foot view of the Enneagram?
Sure. So, yeah, of course, over the last few years, the Enneagram, and specifically the Enneagram of personality, has become a lot more sort of popularized. And in fact, if you jump on Instagram, the meme game is out of control right now, and it's sort of showing up everywhere on T-shirts and coffee mugs. But we're talking about a teaching and a tradition that may be thousands and thousands of years old. This shows up in ancient Egypt, prehistoric Korea. It shows up with the early Greek mathematicians. It may even show up in Homer's book, The Odyssey, Dante's book, The Inferno. When we started to talk about the Enneagram of personality, which is really the sort of type profiles of human character structure, we're really working with an overlay or a teaching here that's just about 45 years old. And so this is one of the newest ways of reading what's sort of tucked away in this drawing or this symbol. What I try to do with what I've learned from the teaching and the tradition is to look past personality and to look past quirks and foibles and caricatures that sort of make us lovable and maybe become some of the most endearing parts of ourselves. And I started to look at a sort of through a contemplative lens, what would it look like to find our way back to our true self? What would it look like to be able to return to essence? What would it look like to actually remember why we exist, the purpose, reason for our soul's being? And could the Enneagram actually sort of shed light on that? And so that's where I sort of started to wrap that sacred language around the teaching.
What do you mean by the sacred map of the soul? What does that allude to?
Well, my sense is we are born purposed. We are born to bring a gift. And what the Enneagram sort of shows us is that there's sort of 9 basic gifts that sort of are shuffled into the souls of the universe and need to show up. The problem is we all lose contact with that, and in the loss of contact with that gift, with that purpose for being, we begin to suffer that loss. And so what we do to cope or to contend with that suffering is we begin to build out personality, and personality becomes a sort of skill set of coping addictions. We wrap this up around, in the Enneagram language, a so-called childhood wound. And we do this so that we don't have to tell ourselves the truth about who we really are, because we would rather stay asleep. We would rather build out scaffolding around the projection of our own ego mythology and not have to tell ourselves the truth, not have to remember what is our purpose for being here. And staying asleep is easy. I mean, I don't know very many people who love to wake up and jump out of bed the first thing in the morning. It's like you want to stay under the covers. You want to hit the snooze. Like there's something about those sort of fuzzy, hazy moments between slumber and awakeness that push and pull us. And I think the Enneagram sort of shows us what that push and pull is.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, Chris, I don't think it's fair, like you just said, to lump this in the mix of popular personality profiles. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's not a personality profile. That's what it's become, and that's what it's become because it does a pretty good job of describing the skills of these coping addictions, these defense tactics, these ways of suffering and these ways of lying to ourselves. The problem is if you look at the Enneagram of personality and you think of this as a personality tool, if you look at the Enneagram of personality and you identify your type and you think you're your type, you've basically missed the point. We're not our type. Our type is, let's say, the prison that we've incarcerated our essence in. And one of my teachers, Sandra Maitre, will sometimes say this. She's like, I'm less interested in describing the thickness of my prison walls than I am turning them transparent. And I think that's really the work here. It's not fixating on your type. It's not sort of thinking you are your type, but it's realizing that type is, like I said, it's the container where you've locked down the best of yourself, hidden it from yourself and hidden it from the world. And so understanding and knowing type is of course the first step here, because, truthfully, if we can't self-observe, we can't self-correct. But man, if you think this is a personality tool, and if you get stuck on type, you've essentially sort of dug your grave even deeper. You've fortified those prison walls. You've sort of put super glue around the seal of this little container that you've hidden your essence in, and that's okay. I mean, that's where a lot of people are. That's where a lot of people stay. But that's why we still see so much pain and division, injustice and suffering, repression and suppression in the world. That's why we see so much division in our relationships. That's why we experience so much loneliness and sadness. And that's why we stay sort of tethered to our addictive compulsions.
Because we're operating out of an identity of fear and shame and guilt, really at the core. Like you had alluded to, that childhood wound is creating the cloak through which we live, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We would prefer to give power to fear and shame and guilt than we would the truth. And that's a bummer. We don't have to, but it just becomes sort of the muscle memory of these harmful addictive behaviors and postures and ways of presenting.
Chris, as a follow-up to that, I'd love to know, how does trauma and shame and fear and guilt then shape us as we develop from a young age in life?
I don't think trauma shapes type, and in fact, I don't think trauma diminishes the gift of essence. I think trauma, wherever it shows up, and it will show up in every person's life, is contended with what we've been able to sort of develop around type. And so type actually sort of also gives us keys and clues on how we relate to our trauma. Now, when you look at the Enneagram and you see the language of childhood wounds, it's unfortunate language, because I think what they're getting at is really, and the language I prefer to use is more of an experience of confirmation bias, that we've lost contact with our essence, that we've been disconnected from our true selves. But we're little kids and we don't have the psychological construct to accurately narrate our reality. So we call this a wound. And in calling it a wound, we look for somebody to blame for causing the wound. And that blame is just one more sort of 2x4 in that scaffolding that we then build out around our ego mythology. So I think, fundamentally, I'm going to say this, I think you're born purposed, you're born to bring a gift, and I think in the losing of contact of that, in the becoming human and things just being what they are, that is a jarring out of essence, and if we give wound language to that, okay, I understand why, but the so-called childhood wound doesn't create type. Like I said, type is the confirmation bias that we've lost contact with. And then what we do in building out type is we lean into things like fear and anger and guilt and shame and regret and disappointment and doubt. And for a lot of people, especially folks who've been socialized in religious communities, they want to take those voices rolling around, let's say in the back of their head, of fear and guilt and shame and disappointment and regret and doubt, and they want to actually think that in fact could be God. But you know this, your notions of the divine are also conditioned, and that God is not as hard on you as you are on yourself. And yes, this is also what this return to essence is.
Well, Chris, what I hear you saying is that the Enneagram is an incredible tool that acts sort of like a flashlight, so that we can see what's working in our soul in order that we can find our way home, if you will. So first of all, is that a true assessment? And then second, how does the Enneagram help us identify those deep motivators in our soul?
Yeah, so I think the Enneagram actually sort of, if you unpack sort of type structure, you're going to see all these elements. You're going to see a holy idea and a virtue. You're going to see a basic desire and a basic fear. You're going to see a passion and a fixation for each of the 9 types. And my sense is these are all sort of things like a flashlight. They're all sort of tools in a toolkit. They're all sort of keys on a key ring. They're all sort of aspects of being able to sort of map where we came from, how we got lost, and either how we stay stuck and lost or how we can return home. And each of these little bits of type structure are important to sort of come to terms with, because they're all sort of stacked and layered and braided together in this larger story of us becoming us, of us remembering who we were.
Wow. Well, Chris, I want to take the conversation and bring it down for those who are, as I said, brand new to the Enneagram. As we dive in, could you give us a brief overview of the 9 types?
Sure. So, like I said, when you enter sort of current or popular conversations on the Enneagram, what we're basically seeing sort of on the landscape in terms of publishing, podcasts, like I said, meme accounts and other things, is in direct relationship to what is called the Enneagram of personality. And this is something that is built off of a Bolivian wisdom teacher by the name of Oscar Ichazo's 108 Enneagons. He introduced these to one of his students, a Chilean Gestalt psychoanalyst whose name was Claudio Naranjo. And in 1971, 72, and 73, Naranjo, along with some graduate students from Berkeley, began to build out type and type structure. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about the Enneagram exposing the 9 archetypes of human character structure. So these types have been given names, and I generally don't use the names because the names describe social function, not essence, but I'll at least sort of hat tip those as we run through this. But type 1, which is sometimes called, and these names really come from the narrative tradition and the folks at the Enneagram Institute, which is sometimes called the reformer or the performer, type 1 are very principled people. They're high valued folks. They have this fundamental fear that they're inherently corrupt, and this comes from a misreading of their early childhood environment, because they have this basic desire simply just to be good, and in fact to be better than good, to be better than is probably humanly possible. It's jarred in the early holding environment through a sort of frustration relationship with a protective caregiver who may not have actually kept the structure in place but allowed it to be fluid. And so as children, these folks want to know what the rules are so that they can actually live into and beyond them to prove that they love folks in their early holding environment, but also that they're being proven as lovable and worthy of love. And because they set their notions of perfection and goodness at really such an unrealistic level, it leads to a lot of inner resentment that they can't live into that goodness and perfection. And so this inner resentment sometimes is expressed as frustration or anger, but the anger is really at themselves. And so, like I said, they're predictably punctual. They're correct in almost everything they say and do. They really live by high values, high morals, high integrity, and highly responsible. And we're grateful when we have folks who are ones in our lives, because they hold us to a higher standard. They actually encourage us to be the best versions of ourselves.
That's awesome.
Type 2 is sometimes called the helper or the reformer. This is, classically the need to be needed, and these are the nurturing folks in the Enneagram. This is the folks who hold space and embrace, who are incredibly heart forward. They're tender, they're compassionate, they're caring. They know what you need before you may even be aware of it as a need, and they're already at work sort of helping meet that need. There's a profound fear here that they're not loved for who they are, because they're so giving and self-sacrificing. They actually sort of on a subconscious level presume that that's why folks love them back. And in the return of that, it fuels sort of the addictive rails that they set this trajectory on. But like I said, it sort of unearths a concern here. Like, what if I stopped giving? What if I stopped meeting everybody else's needs? What if I actually started to take care of myself? Would people still see me? Would people still care about me? Now, folks who are dominant in type 2 struggle with being honest with their needs. They struggle with allowing other people to meet those needs. And there's a kind of presumption there, which is, hey, I know how to love everybody else. Why doesn't everybody know how to love me? And so this creates a little bit of a sadness. And these folks suffer that sadness as a way of convincing themselves to just stay positive and keep their chin up, because to be self-sacrificial, to self-abnegate actually is what they perceive love to look like. It's just not true in terms of loving themselves or allowing themselves to be loved. And so if there's 2s in your life, you really have to find ways to care for them, and you really have to support their own self-care, which is crucial to their sort of waking up. Type 3 is sometimes called the performer or achiever, and type 3 is one of the most disconnected from its own heart. And so in this disconnect from their heart, what people basically would sort of say or see is this is the need to succeed, but it's really not the need to succeed. It's simply that the 3s are trying to be loved, and in trying to be loved, they swap out real love for attention, for recognition, for reward, for affirmation. It's sort of a low-hanging fruit, and it's sort of a substitute, and it becomes sort of an addictive hit. It becomes something that the 3s jones for. And so it's not that the 3s are the most ambitious or the most successful or the most driven of the Enneagram types. It's just that the 3s maybe are a little bit more obvious than the rest of us on how they go about sort of having their needs for love met. The problem is they know that's not love. So on the surface, 3s look, they can present as really image conscious. They like I said, they can present as really driven, that whatever they set their hand to, they're going to succeed in. They're naturally capable in leadership roles, but they're not really dominant kinds of people. They're sometimes a little more understated or low key. And what they're really gifted at is ascribing and adding value to everyone in their life and everything that they do. And this again comes from this basic fear that they don't have intrinsic or inherent value. And so this is also why they think they have to earn that value by becoming more valuable through recognition, affirmation, or reward. Because if they're more valuable, then they're worthy of love, or they're more lovable.
Yeah.
And so you got to keep your eye on these folks, because they struggle with this sort of self-deceptive narrative that they are the roles that they play to get what it is that they want, and that they sort of believe into the dissimilating of the truth for themselves. So type 4 is sometimes called the individualist or the romantic. This is classically the need to be unique. And types 2, 3, and 4 are in the heart center. And so these people really do experience 2s, 3s, and 4s in very different ways. They experience the emotional reality of the world in such fluency. And 2s see that emotional reality and respond to it with benevolence. 3s respond to it and know how to drive it and navigate it and push it forward into successes and into wins. But the 4s read the emotional energy of the world and they essentially try to feed off of it as a way of trying to get to the heart of who they want to be, which is answering this question or this fear, which is, I don't know who I am, and I'm afraid that I don't have sort of inherent significance. And so this loss of identity really sort of creates a kind of frustrated idealism in terms of seeing significance and beauty in everyone else but themselves as a way of trying to have it mirrored back to them. This causes folks who are 4s to really fall deep into their own pain. And their own pain is simply this: I wish I knew who I was. I wish what was in my life was as significant and meaningful and rich and authentic as it seems like it is in everybody else's life. And so that leads to sort of experiences of fantasizing and longing and yearning and wishing for beyond. Now 4s get sort of cliched out as artistic and, like dramatic and overly emotional. And I hate to hear those things, because I think it really misses the point. I think when you see the sort of artistic eye of someone who's a 4, like I said, what they're seeing is the beauty in everything else outside themselves as an attempt to try to see it inside themselves. So there's some deep suffering there. So 5s are sometimes called the investigator or the observer. This is the need to understand. These are the folks who are super cerebrally evacuated into their mind to sort of get to the bottom of everything. And it's hard to sort of guess what's more important to the 5, solutions or actually getting the right question. Regardless, folks can suss everything out. And so they flip thoughts and concepts and things that are very complicated over and over and over again. And they sometimes look a little pokey, but it's not that they procrastinate. It's that they really realize to find any good solution requires thorough investigation. And you can't learn, let's say, everything about computers in a week or 2 weeks. So why would you make a decision on purchasing a computer if you haven't sort of read up on everything there is to read up? They look like they don't need a whole lot, and it's not that they're simple. In fact, they're the most complex mentally of all the types. It's just that there's a utilitarian in it, and it's a kind of brilliance about them. They may only choose 2 or 3 or 4 people in their entire lives who they'll really connect with. And when they do connect with you, when they do choose you, their generosity and loyalty to you is remarkable. But 4s and 5s sort of sit at the bottom of the circle of the drawing there, and are really some of the most misunderstood of the types. Now, type 6 is sometimes called the skeptic or the loyalist. This is a person who really is the fundamental threat forecaster and contingency planner of the Enneagram. They see how everything could possibly go wrong. they take that even further down rabbit trails that leads to just profound concerns and fears in their minds. And doing this to themselves, they sort of get sort of mistaken as being a little cowardly per se, but it's not that they're cowardly. In fact, they're pressing into what it is that they're afraid of, so that they'll take care of and keep the rest of us safe. And so there's a kind of bravery here that sort of is floating below the surface of what can sometimes look like really anxious-minded people who have a tendency to sort of overreact. And we have to remember, once again, this is because of their attempt to offer love and to get love. These folks are incredibly reliable. They're incredibly practical. They're incredibly sensible, but they can be really suspicious. And again, the suspicious edge is part of that threat forecasting. They often don't trust themselves, and so they're often looking for outside guidance, external authorities, and support to reassure them that it's going to be okay. Because, like I said, where their minds take them is to the worst case scenarios, and this isn't necessarily a bad compulsion. Like I said, when this is given over for the care of their community or significant relationships, it can be a gift. But when it becomes an addictive tendency, then yes, it can be mentally paralyzing. The 7 is sometimes called the enthusiast. This is the need to avoid pain. These folks are playful and curious and forever young and always on the go. And this is really part of their fixation, because they don't want to get trapped in their own suffering, and they would prefer to stay disconnected from their own hearts. So they reach out to the hearts of other people and they feed off of this. And in the Enneagram language, this sort of emotional feeding off of experience or other people's hearts, or the possibility of sort of what's next, is sometimes called gluttony. And it's not that these folks overeat, it's a sort of gluttony of overdoing everything that brings them pleasure so that they don't have to face their pain.
Wow.
So they're really good with other people's pains, and this is why they can make incredible humanitarians or therapists or folks in mental health or healthcare vocations. It's that they can get really close to suffering without being emotionally drawn into it. Now the 5s, the 6, and the 7s, these are folks who are in their head center, and they really do sort of rely on the use of their mind to sort of allow for their sense of competency to be their credibility. The 8 is called the challenger. This is the need to be against. These are sort of the larger than life initiating folks who are sort of the biggest bullies, even though they hate bullies. They can be really intimidating and forceful and really sort of exert a lot of need to be in control. And when they're not in control of themselves, a situation, a relationship, then they act out. And their acting out can be abrasive, it can be offensive, but what they're simply trying to do is test the ice between you and them to sort of see, like, is their intensity going to actually push you away? And if not, then can that actually help open up the possibility and the pathway to intimacy? The thing here with the 8s is also just like all the 9 types, they're simply wanting to be loved, and so in wanting to be loved, they push against folks to test folks, and in testing they try to determine the quality of love there. But there's a real invitation here for 8s to sort of reintroduce themselves to their inner child, because in their early holding environments, part of that childhood was accelerated. They may have felt like they had to grow up too quickly. Mm-hmm. And so return to that is sort of a return to their own innocence and their own truth. And then this leaves us with the 9s, who are sometimes called the mediators or the peacemakers. The 9s are incredibly understanding folks who have this really sort of unconscious ability to lower and center and sort of just stabilize the energy anywhere. They see all sides of everything, and they can actually really sort of split the hairs and help other people sort of build bridges between diverse positions, opinions, experiences. But this is sort of the pain of the 9 who forgot something about themselves in their early holding environment. Somebody who sort of thought their parent or parents, their sibling or siblings' needs were more important than theirs. And so in an act to be loving and unselfish, they hid their own needs from the people closest to them. And in hiding their own needs from the people closest to them, they began to forget about themselves. And in forgetting about themselves, they began to minimize who they were at the expense of making everybody else more important. And so what's incredible about their ability to harmonize their external environments is really this sort of sad projection of their inability to unfragment their inner lives, and this is their real work. The 9, just like the 8 and the 1, are in their bodies. These are gut type folks who sort of experience life as too much. So the 8s fight back against that too much, the 9s withdraw, and the 1s
yeah. Wow. Chris, that's so powerful, and you've just given us such a powerful perspective on all 9 types. I think the question begs for everyone listening right now, how do we best discover our type? Is it a test? Is it self-discovery and identification? What do we do?
So there's a lot of ways to bring type forward. And, the easiest, quickest way, of course, is to find a test. But I know there's a lot of teachers out there who really, really advise you not to appeal to a test. The tests, of course, all have their inherent biases, racial, cultural, type biases. The tests generally, I would say, aren't testing to help you discover your essence or your true self. They're helping you discover what is the primary way that you sort of keep yourself asleep. So if you're going to appeal to a test, I do encourage folks to go to the Enneagram Institute's website and to pay the $12 for the RETI test. I think it's probably the best. But I'm going to say this, if you do take a test online, you have to realize that how the tests result don't help you. That, if your top 3 numbers are a 7 and a 3 and a 4, that you're not a 7 with a 3 wing, or that you're not 7 and 3. The tests simply are helping you determine your dominant type. And so everything after that first number really doesn't matter, because this isn't sort of the point here. This isn't a first, second, third place kind of reading. This is really like looking at what's the sort of home base where you actually stay and camp out and sort of build house around your own suffering. If the tests don't work for you, then I actually think the best way to sort of figure this out is to find a mentor, a spiritual director, a conversation partner who's been working on themselves for at least a couple years with their own Enneagram type, and in conversation sort of let that be a sort of a guiding relationship for you to discover yours. And another way to get there, if the tests don't work, if you don't have a conversation partner, then maybe a third way to get there is just to get online or pick up a book of somebody, a teacher, an author, a school that you trust. Read the thick descriptions of the 9 types and sort of see if there's one that really stands out.
That's really good. Well, Chris, I've really begun to discover that my greatest sense of purpose and significance and fulfillment in life is not when I strive to create myself, but instead discover who I was always meant to be. And Chris, that's been a really emotional journey for me out of people-pleasing and perfectionism and shame. I'd love to know, for all of our friends listening today, how can we leverage the gift of the Enneagram to continue to do just that? Like, it's the journey home to our true self.
Yeah. So in my book, The Sacred Enneagram, I didn't want to write a book where you could just turn it to one of 9 chapters, read about yourself and set it down. I actually wanted to sort of help people understand what is the cohesiveness of the system, how do you find yourself in it, and then how do you actually return through contemplative practice or soul work or inner work to what's been lost here. And so that's I think the real work here. I think if you do discern and discover type and you do start to see your tendencies and behaviors, your addictive loops and your defense strategies, to align it with your spirituality and your spiritual practice. And in the book, I actually outline how solitude, silence, and stillness are 3 postures that in 3 different ways help us do this. And then I take consent, which is a sort of intentional saying yes, embrace or engaging what we've lost, or resting in what it is that keeps us distracted, as mindfulness intentions. And when you take solitude, silence, and stillness, consent, engage, and rest, and you wrap it around the Enneagram, what you get is 9 unique combinations, which really, I think, help you align your type with how you do your soul work or your contemplative practice. And I think this is where, in another way, the Enneagram does become a sacred map, that there are 9 paths home. There are 9 ways to sort of get unstuck here.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'm most dominant in type 6. I'd love for you to just take some time and unpack type 6. How do I get stuck? How do I become whole?
Here's where 6s get stuck, right? On either side of 6, you have type 5 and type 7, right? And like I said, 5, 6, and 7 are in the head center. 5, the need to understand. 6, the need to be secure. 7, the need to avoid pain. 6s get confused here because 5s are the most mentally and cerebrally withdrawn, and 7s are the most playful and curious and sort of out there in the world. And as you're, in a sense, trying to hold hands with these 2 numbers on your wings, you can't make sense of them. And so what you do is you step back. And so 6s, in the end, become the most disconnected from their own head centers. And this is why they can become overly anxious and have been sort of rendered out as the quintessential fear type of the Enneagram. In the book, what I basically try to say is for 6s to face that fear is what courage looks like. It doesn't mean that you overcome your fear, and it doesn't mean that you're not afraid. It just means that you take power away from fear, and you expose fear as illusion. You expose fear as malformation of truth. And so the path that I suggest for 6s is actually in embracing or engaging in interior silence. Now, for a lot of 6s, what happens when they drop into a silent mindfulness practice is all the things that they haven't thought of, all the worst case scenarios they didn't consider, actually come running to the top of their heads. And so in silence, there's a sort of different kind of addiction here, and the 6s can get even more overwhelmed. And that's why you have to show up in silence and hold that silence and learn to be disciplined in that silence. That's why 6s need to embrace it, because if you don't embrace it and you don't take control of it, and you don't hold it, then you're going to be controlled by it. It is going to hold you, and in holding you, it's going to take you to some pretty terrible spots mentally.
Chris, most of us in this conversation today are following Jesus, and I'd love to know, how can we use the Enneagram to take our relationship with the Lord to the next level? Well,
I think if you, like I said, if you do get to a point where you can discern and know your type, then I think what you're first and foremost given in that discovery is, hey, here are some of the primary ways I keep myself from giving and receiving love, and I think this is true in your significant relationships and your community, but also in your faith experiences. And like I said earlier, it's like, God isn't as hard on us as we are on ourselves. I'm also going to say this: God wants to love us more than we want to be loved, and I think our type keeps us from receiving that love. And so if you can see that and you can understand that, like I said, that's the work that I think contemplative practices and these mindfulness intentions actually also help address and arrest, is sort of allowing us to get back to that place of being loved and being sources of love.
And that's where I think contemplative practice is so helpful, Chris, because Scripture teaches us to enter His rest. And I would think, by what you just said, we can use contemplative practice to help us do just that. Like, we're working from identity instead of striving for it, right?
I mean, that's one of the characteristic ways that we suffer, that we don't, in a sense, first of all, know what our true identity is. That second, we allow the fragments of who we think we are to lay claim to the whole of who we want to be. And that third, we've lost that because we've not rooted it in this intrinsic, inherent value and dignity that's ascribed that can't be earned. And so
Sure.
I mean, that's the thing. Like this book, The Sacred Enneagram, I would say it's fundamentally a book about identity and coming to terms with the gifts and challenges of that.
I agree.
And the follow-up that I'm working on is going to fundamentally be about belonging, that once we can sort of receive the gifts of identity, now we're actually capable of belonging to ourselves.
Oh, wow.
And our notion of the divine.
That's going to be awesome. When does that come out, Chris?
Maybe spring, summer-ish of 2020. We'll keep our fingers crossed here.
Awesome. I can't wait for that. Chris, I'd love to know, how can we use the Enneagram as a roadmap to help us recognize triggers and then situations that would typically cause us to self-sabotage and retract in fear and self-protect and even self-promote in arrogance and pride?
Just recognizing what it is that you've lost contact with. It's just recognizing how you suffer that loss of contact, and it's realizing that in the overuse of your mechanisms for suffering that become addictive, they become sort of a mental and emotional hamster wheel that will keep you stuck. And so learning to observe them is just, it's the simple and profound work.
And in knowing, that gives us a target to then pursue wholeness in, correct?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, it's so good. Chris, this is going to sound overly simplistic, but I want to just reinforce this for everyone joining our conversation today. But what happens when we reconnect with our true self?
Well, I think you wake up out of your illusions. I think you tell yourself the truth that your so-called childhood wound wasn't a wound, and you stop blaming folks. And I think you loosen the addictive grasp of your types, passions, and fixations. I don't think that they ever won't be there. I think, in fact, the awareness of them and the experience of them are constant reminders that we need to sort of stay humble, to stay truthful, and to stay vulnerable.
That's such a powerful way to land this conversation. And Chris, I'd love to leave the opportunity for you to leave last words with everyone joined in this conversation. What would you have to say to them to encourage them to begin the journey or to continue the journey to become their best self?
Sure. I mean, like I said, if I don't say this 100 times, I haven't said it enough. If you can't self-observe, you can't self-correct. And so learn to see yourself truthfully for the good and for the bad. And that's really an act and an intentional sort of work of compassion for self.
That's really powerful. Folks, he is Chris Heuertz. Chris, thank you so much for joining this conversation today. What a powerful value add this has been. And I really believe that people can head on the journey home in a much clearer way.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Chris Heuertz. Again, he's the author of the book, The Sacred Enneagram. I have links in the show notes at wintoday.tv where you can purchase the book. And in addition, if you go to enneagraminstitute.com, you can take the Enneagram test to discover your type. I think, like Chris said, it's $10 or $12. Very much worth it. But hey, let's recap a few key statements from the conversation with Chris. I think this may have been the most powerful statement. But Chris said, if you can't self-observe, you can't self-correct. Think about that. Then Chris said, the muscle memory of dysfunction in our life is fear, guilt, and shame. I really loved it when Chris said this. He said, God is often not as hard on you as you are on yourself. Man, that has been so true in my own life because I struggle with perfectionism. And it's not that I don't want to do things right the first time. It's just that I beat myself up and say, hey, Chris, your self-worth, your value is contingent upon your good performance. That's no way to live, guys. As a follow-up to that statement, Chris said, God wants to love you more than you want to be loved. I want to say that again. Some of you need to hear that in your heart. God wants to love you, my friend, more than you want to be loved. Well, listen, next week on the show, Kim Walker-Smith from Jesus Culture is here to join me. She's sharing an aspect of her story many have never heard before. You don't want to miss it. Here's a preview.
I learned in this whole process that a lot of times there are moments in our past that are so traumatic and scary, and it can be really terrifying to revisit those things. And if you will surrender to God and trust Him, He will bring you back to those moments in the right time and in the right way. And that there's some moments that you don't have to revisit in order for him to bring healing and wholeness.
That's next week, right here on Win Today. Don't miss my conversation with Kim Walker-Smith from Jesus Culture. Well, listen, many of you have taken the time to rate and write a review of the show on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts, and for that, I am so grateful. But at the same time, many of you are new to this show, and I'd love to invite you and ask you to do the same. It would mean a lot, and I promise it'll take no more than 30 seconds to do so. And of course, you can also find me on social media. Let's hang out. I am ridiculously easy to find. I'm at 00 Chris Cook on all the socials. And until next week, visit me over at wintoday.tv for blog posts and archive podcasts, all aimed at helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. We'll see you next week with Kim Walker-Smith. Have an awesome one, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.